Well, thanks everybody, and especially to the Joes and the Center for having us. This is exciting for me as a scholar whose expertise such that it is tends towards the west side of the conference title rather than the Twain side. I realized as I was pulling this together that I hadn't really written a conference paper since 2019, and as I was starting to pull it together from my notes, I joked to Matt that I was going to include a reference to this Twitter thread. I think all my conference energies went into Twitter over the COVID break, right? But I was going to reference this Twitter thread, and I started writing my paper sort of based on that thread and realized I produced about 6 minutes of material on Matt's Twitter thread without saying anything about roughing it. So I'll save that for the end if I end up having time. But so for now, we'll launch into roughing it. So for nearly 40 years, scholars of Western history and American studies have read the Goshoot episode in Roughing It as a sort of set piece that offers a damning revelation about Twain's attitude toward indigenous peoples. I won't rehearse it, but there it is, I'm sure it's familiar. In these readings, the passage cited here affirms the idea that when it comes to indigenous peoples, Twain abandoned the salutary critique of his humor in order to embrace a logic of racial hierarchy that could only find its end in genocidal violence. In her 1985 monograph preceding Legacy of Conquest, Desert Passages, Patricia Nelson Limerick writes that in the Goshoot episode, quote, Twain seems to have forgotten his stance as a fool, and that he proclaims his opinions with a self-righteous certainty comparable to Fremont's. In his 2006 monograph, Violence Over the Land, historian Ned Blackhawk cites the episode as an even more egregious example of the imperial tropes that Amy Kaplan finds in Twain's representations of Native Hawaiians and the Anarchy of Empire. In her 2011 monograph, Transit of Empire, Jody Bird, building on Blackhawk's reading, argues that Twain felt it was a service to put Indians out of their destitution through ghost shooting that would finally and fully trap them in a sanitized and distant past. So what's remarkable about all these readings is that they excise the final paragraph in Twain's description of the Goshutes. And this is the one where he kind of ostensibly turns this around, right, and compares the Goshutes to the presumably white porters on the Baltimore and Washington Railroad, right? So, if taken at face value, this final, whatever that means when reading Roughing It, right? This final humorous parabasis, comparing the Goshutes to the very representatives of industrial modernity, would seem to tinge all that has come before with irony, subverting the hierarchical racial logic that the readings cited above ascribe to the scene. But even those more recent readings which do attend to this parabasis tend to dismiss it as a failed joke. In her 2018 monograph, Mark Twain Among the Indians and Other Indigenous Peoples, which gives us a far more comprehensive and nuanced picture of Twain's racial attitudes regarding indigenous peoples than we could glean from this passage, Quarry interprets this parabasis as a kind of bad faith gesture that attempts to cover over the genocidal tracks established in the preceding paragraphs. In a fascinating 2020 article comparing Twain's use of parabasis in Roughing It, parataxis, in Roughing It, to that deployed by Sarah Winnemucca, in her writings, Timothy Donahue argues that the joke constitutes a failed ethical gesture because, first, it is an inadequate counterweight to the foregoing pages of derision. Second, it substitutes for the ascription of a low position within a racial hierarchy a plausible comparability among settler indigenous tribes, a suggestion of similitude that hides the political distinction of actually existing indigenous peoples. Settler colonialism often advances via an inclusive, incorporative logic that elides distinctions in political standing between native peoples and U.S. citizens. So, if scholars from Limerick to Donahue are united in their belief that the Goshoot episode stands apart from Twain's more salutary deployments of ironic humor, in my reading today, I want to ask that we consider what might happen if we take Twain's irony in the Goshoot episode seriously, not as a means toward ethical exculpation, but rather toward a more nuanced political understanding of Twain's relation to the mutable and historically contingent structure of violence that is settler colonialism. The Goshoot episode, contrary to the censorious judgments drawn in readings like Limerick's, can be read as a liberal critique of the ethnocentric narratives that imagine westward expansion as a triumphalist legitimation of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority. It is important to note that, like contemporary liberal critiques of racism, Twain's criticism is markedly partial. it articulates a sort of paratactic chain of equivalencies, to borrow formulation of Zizek's on irony, between different cultures within the expanding US polity without acknowledging, as Donahue suggests, the very real differences latent in the material injustices perpetrated against indigenous peoples and other subordinated races and ethnic groups during the process of expansion. In positioning Twain's liberal irony against the genocidal theories of racial hierarchy, my goal is not to serve as an apologist for his liberalism, but rather to offer analysis of the structure of this early example of the liberal politics of recognition that, in the decades following Roughing It's publication, would come to supplant frontier homicide and overt ideologies of white supremacy as US settler colonialism's primary tool for the elimination of indigenous nations. In developing this argument in the brief time we have today, I just want to touch on three aspects of my longer paper. First, a claim about the Goshoot episode in the broader discursive context of Indian hating in Western travelogues. Second, some thinking about the function of irony in Roughing It beyond the Goshoot episode. And finally, a consideration of Twain's irony in relation to historical shifts in US settler colonialism occurring over the course of his career. So first, turning to the Goshoot episode in the context of its genre. Quarry and others at the Mark Twain Project have provided an invaluable service in terms of sourcing the Goshoot episode. I don't have anything too revelatory to add here, except to draw attention to one work I haven't seen discussed in this context. I'd be very curious to hear what the more archivally minded here can say about this. So, okay, so what is this passage? It's drawn from George Douglas Brereton's account of his 1848 journey on the Old Spanish Trail from Los Angeles to New Mexico, what is now New Mexico. What this account, this was not published in book form until the 20th century when it was published as Overland with Kit Carson. Curiously, was one of Kerouac's important sources for On the Road. But it was first published in Harper's in 1853, when Twain would have been in New York working as a typesetter. We know he was reading Harper's at that time. I don't know if he's read this particular passage. But looking at the similarities here, from the reference to the Digger Indians to this kind of obsession with diet to the assertion of a racial hierarchy at which the Diggers exist at the very bottom, right? One can't help but see some parallels. So, what can we say about this? It's not necessary to make any strong claim on Brereton's direct influence on Twain to point out that the passage illustrates a salient fact that ought to be considered in tandem with Carey's argument that many of Twain's sources present far more charitable assessments of the plight of indigenous peoples of Nevada and California than the one that Twain offers us. By the time he was penning Roughing It, the kind of racial taxonomy Twain deploys in the Goshoot episode was a decades-old trope that was at least as prominent as that of the noble savage that he lampoons when he's talking about Cooper, right, in the US settler colonial imaginary. Considered in light of this fact, the extravagant inconsistencies of Twain's logic in his assertion of the Goshutes' evolutionary inferiority seemed to me more a mockery of well-established representational tradition than an expression of self-righteous certainty. Having established with minute specificity the nature of the Goshutes' inferiority when compared to all other Indians, and indeed to almost all other indigenous peoples globally, Twain contradictorily generalizes the Goshutes' condition to describe that of all American Indians, when he says, wherever one finds an Indian tribe, he has only found Goshutes more or less modified in circumstances and surroundings. The overall effect of the passage can be understood then as a bifurcated parody in which Twain rejects both Cooper's romance of the noble savage and the emerging scientific discourse on racial hierarchy. This reading is consistent with the leveling effect of irony, and I think this relates to Sarah's talk, that Twain describes in Roughing It more broadly. Though throughout Twain's narrative, ironic speech acts are represented as the force that forestalls violence and incorporates difference into a nascent democratic polity. Indeed, it's that anti-hierarchical force of irony that Twain, in recounting the stagecoach drivers who called each other son of a bitch without intending offense, describes as the vigorous new vernacular of the Occidental plains and mountains. And this scene finds a weird afterlife in Owen Wister's The Virginian. For those Western readers among us, where there's a scene where the eponymous character points a gun at somebody who calls him a son of a bitch and says, when you call me that, smile, Anyway. Nowhere in Roughing It is the relationship among irony, violence, and ethnic difference more concisely articulated than in the story of Buck Fanshaw's funeral. Having colorfully described Buck's obvious suicide, Twain notes how an informally organized jury declares the death caused by a visitation of God. He then goes on to describe the whole camp mobilizing to plan the funeral, but pauses parenthetically to comment on the challenge of organizing communal action in the mining camps. Oh, let's see. Oh, do I have this one? Oh, there's the... okay, so this sort of familiar quote has been discussed a couple times already, right, about the nature of slang in the mining camps in early Nevada. Just want to draw special attention, though, to the "No Irish Need Apply" line. So Buck's eulogy, delivered by the miner Scotty Briggs, includes the repeated insertion of "No Irish Need Apply," stripped of its ethnocentric meaning. As Scotty explains, Buck's word was "No Irish Need Apply," but that didn't make no difference when it came down to what a man's rights was. And so when some roughs jumped the Catholic boneyard and started in to stake out town lots in he'd win for them. So in this episode, Twain represents the mining camp as a nascently democratic space in which language verges on the non-representational, but also a community where, quote, nothing can be done without a public meeting or an expression of sentiment. Twain thus imagines the frontier of American sovereignty as a space in which irony interpolates subjects into a liberal polity that opens itself to racial and ethnic difference. And an interesting connection here, of course, with the No Irish Need Apply thing to Niagara, right, where he draws that distinct, that correlation between indigenous peoples and Irish immigrants. Okay, so while the utopian expression of cultural pluralism participates, as Donahue asserts, in a settler colonial discourse, insofar as it operates by an inclusive and corporative logic that that elides distinctions in political standing, it is important to note that in Twain's day, this incorporative mode was an emergent rather than a dominant mode of settler sentiment. As Australian historian Patrick Wolfe, Donahue's source for the claim about settler colonialism cited there, notes, the decades in which Twain's career unfolded were coeval with a key transformation in the strategy, if not the aims, of the U.S. settler project. Over the course of this shift, in Wolfe's words, the settler colonial logic of elimination in its crudest form, i.e. homicidal violence, was transformed into a paternalistic mode of governmentality, which, though still sanctioned by state violence, came to focus on assimilation rather than rejection. So thinking about what Wolfe argues here, in the 1840s you have the Department of Indian Affairs move from the Department of War to the Department of the Interior, and then by the end of Twain's career, you've got the boarding schools, you've got Pratt saying, kill the Indian, save the man, which now seems to us a succinct formulation of a kind of cultural genocide, right? But at the time was kind of reformist. So in asking us to consider the Goshoot episode as an example of liberal irony, I'm asking us to consider Twain's struggles to reckon with settler colonialism as a structure of violence he revolted against, but whose logics he was ultimately unable to transcend. A nuanced assessment of the ways Twain's irony is imbricated into settler colonial logics might deny us the incisiveness of a more censorious form of ethical judgment, but also avoids the temptation to judge Twain against a transhistorical and thus implicitly ontological and intractable understanding of what settler colonialism is. By recognizing the complexity in one of the most troubling episodes in Twain's body of work, we aren't letting Twain off the hook so much as assessing his relation to settler colonialism understood as a mutable structure that, in Wolfe's words, being historically contingent, can be overcome. Thanks.